All right, well, let me introduce a good friend of mine, Dr. Craig Keener. You know what? Craig is such a humble guy, and I mean this sincerely. Craig is such a humble guy that if I told you some of the stories I do know about him, he would just sit here and probably wilt and tell me I wish you hadn't said those things. Yes, he's extremely humble. This guy makes all of us in the profession embarrassed to say we write books, because he writes in about a week what I write in a month. Seriously, if I write 3 to 4 pages in a day, I'm on top of the world. I asked Craig just a few months ago, how many pages do you write in a day? He said, I'd say probably 20. I don't know anybody in our fields who write 20 pages a day, except Craig. And just one story. Craig was under contract to write a commentary in the book of Acts. He just told us over dinner tonight it was supposed to be about 1,000 pages. They excommunicated him after this book because his first volume, introduction and the first 2 chapters, was over 1,000 pages long. As someone said at the dinner table tonight, that's more than Luke wrote. Craig, are all 4 volumes done now? They're done. They're just waiting to come out. And the book's going to be a little over 4,000 pages. Luke's was inspired at his, is it? But his commentary in Acts was 7,000 manuscript pages. And by the way, his 2 books, 1,100 pages on miracles, that's an addendum. That's a footnote to the Acts book, because he was into the Acts book when he started doing the miracles to try to say, are the things that Luke explains in the book of Acts still happening today? So this guy, seriously, is a scholar. The New Testament scholars in the world love Craig and his work because it's a careful kind of work that we all wished we had time to go through. And he not only teaches a full load at Asbury Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky, but he does the writing too. You tell him how you write. He writes all night, then he teaches during the day. He's going to come up and talk to us today about modern day miracles. Did the things that happened in the book of Acts, did they really happen? And what does that say about the world we live in? Correct?
Here it goes. Can we applaud Gary because of the transition we didn't get to? I'm grateful for that introduction, but the 20 pages a day, that's only in the time that I'm actually writing. There's also time when I go back and edit what I wrote, and then indexing and so on. So it's not like every day I'm writing 20 pages, but yeah, I'm grateful that I got to do the Miracles book. It did start as a footnote, and I wasn't really planning to turn it into a book. I thought somebody else had written the book that it turned out being, and when I didn't find one initially, then I ended up doing more, and it grew and grew, and eventually it was too long for a footnote, so we moved on, but thanks be to God. Is this forward? Oh, pointed at the computer. Maybe it doesn't work on a Mac. I don't know. Oh, maybe, let's see. It's changing yours. It's not changing mine. Okay. No, it's all right. In the meantime, I'm going to forward this one this way. David Friedrich Strauss was very much influenced by David Hume, who was mentioned earlier. This is nothing to pick on people named David. My son is named David. But David Friedrich Strauss believed that you couldn't really trust the miracle stories in the Gospels and Acts, that they arose by the process of legendary accretion. Thanks so much. It was right side up. he didn't believe that they would come from eyewitnesses. These were things that grew over time as a result of legend. Interestingly, there was a German Lutheran pastor by the name of Johann Christoph Blumhardt who prayed for a friend of Strauss. Strauss's friend was disabled, he couldn't walk. After Blumhardt prayed for him, he could walk. Now Strauss said he must have just been psychosomatically unable to walk. It's interesting, however, he didn't say this report only arose as a result of legendary accretion. And that's part of what I wanted to challenge in my book on miracles, to show that at the very least, however you explain them, you can't say that these things arose by legend, because eyewitnesses today claim the same range of events as we have in the Gospels, apart from the resurrection of Jesus. But there's also the issue of why he said that, and that was because he was working from anti-supernaturalistic presuppositions, depending on David Hume. Hume regarded miracles as violations of natural law, which was probably deliberately provocative language. He was condensing a lot of arguments from deists who had come before him. But I'm going to skip some of this material and focus especially on Hume's argument about witnesses, which is kind of the focus of where his argument goes. Hume was very much into arguing that we should think inductively, but his argument is not at all inductive. He says that human experience shows us that miracles can't happen. Well, what happens when you have well-supported eyewitness claims for miracles? He says, well, we know that those can't be true because miracles cannot be shown to have happened because... Thus he dismissed Jansenist reports, who were an easy target for him because they were too Augustinian for the Jesuits in France, and they were too Catholic for the Protestants. But if you've heard of Blaise Pascal, his niece had an open running eyesore that emitted a foul odor. And she had had this for a long time. She was instantly and publicly healed. And the Queen Mother of France even sent her physician to check it out. Hume points to this. He says, well, look, we have a report of this. It's far better documented than anything we have in the New Testament. And yet we know this couldn't have happened. So why would we believe anything in the New Testament? And that's his argument. There have been a number of recent major philosophic challenges to Hume on miracles published by Cambridge, Cornell, Oxford, and so on. The book by John Earman, someone critiqued it saying, you just say this because you're Christian, to which Earman responded, I'm not a Christian. I just thought Hume had a bad argument. Hume's principle of uniformity, the past is not different from today. It was actually developed more fully by Ernst Troeltsch. But today, the principle of analogy is more likely to support healings in the Gospels, as we have a fuller knowledge of reports around the world than Hume did. Although the reports that Hume did have, or could have had from around the world, he probably would have dismissed because of his monocultural prejudices. Hume said that only ignorant and barbarous nations affirm miracles. If somebody said this today, we'd call them an ethnocentric bigot, which in fact Hume basically was. Hume doubted exceptional persons of color. He talked about this one Jamaican. He says, oh yeah, it's said that he can recite poetry, but any parrot can repeat what it hears. The Jamaican to whom he was referring was Francis Williams, who composed poetry in English and in Latin. I would consider that pretty smart. Bultmann was not necessarily coming from direct ethnocentric prejudice like Hume. I mean, Hume was used by his successors in support of slavery, is how far Hume went. But Bultmann, I think Bultmann just didn't know about some of the claims around the world. He said nobody in the modern world believes in miracles. And I brought this up with one of my professors who was a Bultmannian. I said, you know, Bultmann's approach to this, without offering any argument, just saying nobody in the modern world believes in miracles, case closed, excludes from the modern world all traditional Jews, Christians, Muslims, traditional tribal religionists, 2/3 of the graduate students sitting around this table, basically everybody except his mid-20th century Western academic elite. He said modern people don't believe in miracles, at least mature modern people. Justo Gonzalez, by contrast, citing Latino churches, declares what Bultmann declares to be impossible is not just possible but even frequent. Philip Jenkins has documented it throughout the global South, and there are a number of other works that have made this case. But even in the United States, a 2008 Pew Forum survey suggested that 34% of Americans claim to have witnessed or experienced divine or supernatural healing. Now, the point is not what proportion of these claims we would necessarily call miracles. Wherever we stand, none of us would call all of them really miracles. But the point is whether Hume can legitimately start from the premise that nobody in the modern world, well, Bultmann's premise, nobody in the modern world believes in miracles, or Hume's, that uniform human experience rules out miracle claims. The claims can hardly be, the human experience can hardly be uniform on the point, or we can at least hardly start with that assumption when we have so many contrary claims. How widespread are healing claims? Well, if we start from the churches that are particularly known for that emphasis among Pentecostal and charismatic circles, there was another Pew Forum survey that was done of 10 countries, especially Pentecostals and charismatics in these 10 countries. And in these 10 countries alone, and among Pentecostals and charismatics in these 10 countries alone, the estimated total of these people claiming to have witnessed divine healings, again, this is 10 countries alone and Pentecostals and charismatics alone, comes out to around 200 million people. And that's not even including the charismatic Catholics. That was just the Protestant Catholics. What may be more surprising to most people today is that among the other Christians in those 10 countries alone, around 39% claim to have witnessed divine healing. So perhaps over 1/3 of Christians worldwide who do not identify themselves as Pentecostal or charismatic claim to have witnessed divine healings. Often this occurs most dramatically in areas that are groundbreaking evangelism areas. J.P. Moreland has pointed out that about 80% of church growth in the past 20 years has been due to signs and wonders around the world. China was not among the 10 countries in the survey that we just noted, but a report from within the official China Christian Council, affiliated with the Three Self Church, about 10 years ago, reported that half of the new conversions of the last 20 years have been caused by faith-healing experiences. Some of the sources within the house church movement in rural areas suggest closer to 90%. Now, I can't tell you exactly what percentage it actually was, but the point is, overall, we're talking about millions of people to whom we cannot attribute Christian prejudice starting out. These are people who were not Christians, who abandoned and changed centuries of tradition because they believed that they or somebody close to them had been healed, and it wasn't just some sort of recovery that they saw on a regular basis. This was something they considered dramatic. In India, in Chennai, there was a study done a number of years ago when it was called Madras, and 10% of the non-Christians there said that they had been healed in answer to Christian prayer in the name of Jesus. At least 10% of those that were interviewed. And about 30% said that they knew somebody who had been so healed. I'm going to be giving examples. I'm giving just a few examples. Obviously, there are many, many more in the book. But I'm going to try to get it into the time frame. I'm going to be moving quickly through a number of them. These examples are examples from people I've interviewed, especially people I know personally, or I know somebody who knows them personally, or I have other very good reasons to trust their reliability. One principle that I'm following is that a smaller number of witnesses should be counted more heavily than a larger number of skeptical non-eyewitnesses. For example, if there's a traffic accident and the police officer pulls over starts interviewing the people who witnessed the accident. And the witnesses are saying, well, this happened, and then somebody says, no, that didn't happen. And the police officer says, well, sir, what did you see? And the person says, well, I didn't see anything. That's why I know it didn't happen. That's really not a good basis for determining what happened. So, we don't count heads about how many people say things didn't happen. We are more interested in what eyewitnesses claim to have happened, which is what we have to do with historical documents. It's what we have to do with the New Testament. So I'm going to start first with the account of Therese Magnuha. I actually have some more dramatic accounts than this, but this one was one that was particularly moving to me for reasons that you will soon understand. When she was about 2 years old, she cried out that she had been bitten by a snake. And her mother found her not breathing. There was no medical help available in the village, so she strapped the child to her back, and she ran to a nearby village where a family friend, Coco Ngoma Moise, was doing ministry. And Coco Moise prayed for her, and Therese started breathing again. And the next day she was fine. So I asked the mother, how long was it that Therese was not breathing? And she had to stop and think about going up this hill and down that hill, getting from the one village to the next. She said, about 3 hours. Now, 6 minutes with no oxygen causes irreparable brain damage. But she's now finished her master's degree in a seminary in Cameroon. And this really touched me because Therese is my wife's sister, and the witness is my mother-in-law. And also, we did check with Coco Moise, who was still alive at the time. And over in that corner, the very lovely one is my wife. Many church fathers claimed to be eyewitnesses of healings and exorcisms that were converting many polytheists. In fact, Ramsay MacMullen, and he seemed reluctant about this in an interview I heard, but he documents that in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the leading cause of conversion to Christianity was healings and exorcisms. And it continued through the later church. There are a number of stories we could tell from Augustine. Augustine originally believed these things had died out, for the most part. But he retracted that later on in his writings. City of God 22:8, he gives a list of miracles that had happened in his own diocese, some things that he had witnessed or experienced. I talked about within the diocese healings of blindness, raisings from the dead, and so on, that they had collected over 70 affidavits of different healing claims, and he knew of other people who hadn't turned in the data. I'm going to just concentrate on certain kinds of healing claims for the sake of time, but we have a large number of reports of healings of blindness. And I don't want you to get the wrong idea. We have far more people who haven't been healed of it than who have been healed of it, but that's a different kind of subject. We're talking about miracles. So one of the accounts I have, one of my students at a Baptist seminary where I taught, before I taught at Asbury, was Paul Mokake, who did his master's degree there and then his DMin. And he had a number of reports for me, but he had gone back to Cameroon, and one of our other students, Yolanda McCain, who was from Philadelphia, went to visit Cameroon, and she was there when Paul prayed for someone who was blind and they were able to see. And so she came back and she was telling us about it. So I asked Paul, and he said, oh, yeah. But he had so many stories. There are a number of cases where eyes white from cataracts. We have eyewitnesses who saw them instantly healed. We also have some publicly documented, publicly acknowledged, medically documented cases where eye scarring disappeared. This is Dr. Kato. He's the president of Shalom University in Bunia, the DRC, Congo DRC. And we were doing some work on ethnic reconciliation together. So I asked him one day, since I was working on the Miracles book, by the way, do you have any miracle stories? He said, well, yeah, years ago, when we were out doing evangelism in a village, a few of us, they brought to us a woman who was blind. And so we were asked to pray for her. And we'd never done that before. But we said, well, we came that God's name might be glorified. So let's just pray and see what God might do. And they started praying, and after about 2 minutes, this woman who was, he thinks, in her 60s, she started shouting, I can see, and began dancing around. And she remained sighted for the rest of her life. A friend of mine, Flint McLaughlin, who was director of the Cambridge Business Institute, he was in India with some other people. I consulted one of them as well. And he prayed for a blind man with clouded eyes. And the man was instantly healed. This is the field where he ran in circles praising God. And here is where the man began to weep as he was coming to give his testimony that night. And someone asked him, why are you weeping? He said, I've always heard the voices of the children, but I'd never seen them before. I'm going to give some accounts of raisings from the dead, because normally people don't consider people to be psychosomatically dead. So I'm just going to give a few samples. There are some of these in the Church Fathers. Wesley, in his journal. Now, this is not something that was recorded a long time later. This is recorded at the time of the events. He prayed for somebody, Mr. Myrick, that he believed was dead, and the man came back. We have scores of these testimonies. Obviously, again, most people who die stay dead, but this is just saying we do have some exceptions. A pastor in Mumbai shared with me this, and this isn't one of the strongest cases, but since I'm using PowerPoint, I'm using the ones where I have pictures. So, believers found a Hindu boy, Vikram, lying at the bottom of a pool at a retreat center where they were visiting. And so 2 of them took him to a hospital where they pronounced him dead. They took him to another hospital where they also pronounced him dead. But an hour and a half later, they came back. While the believers were all praying, they came back with the boy alive. And these pictures are from him after they brought him back alive. He said that he heard the name Jesus and then was rescued. His Hindu parents said he's never heard that name before. And this is a picture of them joining in the worship service of the Christians afterwards. This is a testimony. It's not featured very much in the Miracles book because I met the person afterwards. This is Yusuf Herman, and I have this picture because he's the one who put me in touch with this other person. He knows the person very well. But I put this picture first to remind me, to warn you that if you get queasy at the sight of blood, you need to close your eyes until further notice, or at least until you can tell I've moved on to another topic and forgot to tell you. This is a person, you can see he was dead. His neck was cut. Actually, they'd moved his body. There was more blood in the field where he was. But they cut his throat. The way they were transporting him to the hospital obviously was not very good for a body that would be alive either. These were pictures from the news. I had the news report, and I took these out of the news report. In this case, it required medical intervention, but he had an NDE. He had an experience of heaven, and then when they were getting ready to pronounce him dead and send him to the morgue, he said, I'm still alive. And they said, oh. And so they started working on sewing back his neck. I was giving some of these accounts, and I have so many more of these, but for the sake of time, I was giving some of these accounts at a Society of Biblical Literature meeting where I was not trying to persuade people of the supernatural. I was simply saying, you know, our reading strategies, maybe we could learn something from the majority world where they don't find these an embarrassment, but they can resonate more with these stories that we have in the New Testament, because look, we have stories like this today. And after I'd finished, Ayo Adewuya, who's a professor now in the U.S., but he's from Nigeria originally, he stood up in the back and he said, I have one of those stories. My son was stillborn, and the midwife and I prayed for 30 minutes, and my son came back to life. And his son has now finished a Master of Science degree at the University of London. Again, no brain damage. In any of these cases, no brain damage. Another account, just because I was working the Miracles book, I thought, well, you know, I worked together with Leo Bawo when I was in Nigeria, and I know he did a lot of research. He traveled around. I wonder if he had any miracle stories. So I asked him. He said, well, just a few. One of the ones he gave me was where he was doing ministry in a village, and the neighbors of his host brought over their son, who apparently had just died. And he took their child, prayed for a couple hours, and handed the child back to the family alive. There are a number of examples from Congo-Brazzaville, which is where my wife is from, including from the president of the largest Protestant denomination there, Église Évangélique du Congo. I could give a lot of these, but actually I'm doing fine. All right, let me give you one of these. Albert Bisweswe was a school inspector in the north of Congo. All these testimonies from Congo, by the way, are from close friends of our family. They're from the mainline evangelical Protestant church of Congo-Brazzaville. So he was a school inspector in the north of Congo, and he was at his office one day at work, and he heard a commotion around his house. So he went over there and found a crowd gathered around a dead girl that was lying on the ground. She had died about 8 hours earlier, and she had blood smeared in all of her orifices. They had taken her to various local healers first to sacrifice some animals and smeared the blood in her eyes, her ears, her nose, and her mouth, trying to resuscitate her somehow, and it didn't work. And so they brought her to Albert Bisweswe, saying, well, maybe your God can do something. And he said, you should have come here first. You need to turn from all these other gods and turn to the true and the living God. He bent down and prayed for her. She came back to life. And it was such a phenomenon in the village that later on, before they'd moved out of that village, it was Etumbi, another child died, and they came to get him, but he was out of town. So they got his wife instead, and she prayed. And in this case also, the child was raised. Now, obviously, it doesn't always happen, but it happened in those cases. A number of claims from India, a number of claims from China. Some of the ones from India, there was one where a government official's son lay dying. This was among the Nishi tribal people in the northeast. And the son was dying, and they tried everything. They tried medical help. They tried praying to different deities, sacrificing to different deities. And the pharmacist said, well, why don't you pray to Jesus, the Christian God? He raised somebody named Lazarus from the dead. So the official found his son dead, and he said, Jesus, the Christian God, if you raise my son, I will become your follower. And he prayed. His son was raised from the dead, and that was the beginning of the people movement, well-documented people movement that began to spread among the Nishi tribal people. Vast numbers of them turned to faith in Christ. 2 Western sociologists were interviewing locals, including a Hindu village elder, about a woman returning to life after being pronounced dead when a Christian prayed for her. Another Indian pastor prayed for a girl who was dead with worms coming out her nose. She shared her postmortem experience. The local newspapers covered it. So it wasn't just Christians who knew about it. Among doctors, we also have reports of this. One of them is from a cardiologist, West Palm Beach. A man named Jeff Markin checked himself into the hospital with chest pains, collapsed in the emergency room. They tried for 40 minutes to resuscitate him, and finally they called Chauncey Crandall in, the cardiologist who was making his rounds elsewhere in the hospital, to just pronounce him dead. So he came in to pronounce him dead, and he went back to his rounds, and he felt the Holy Spirit leading him to go back and pray for this man. So he came back. The nurse was sponging the body down. Dr. Crandall told me he laid hands on the man's head and said, God, if you want this man to have another chance to know you, please raise him from the dead. And then turned to his colleague who had just walked in with him and said, shock him with the paddle one more time. And the nurse was looking at him like, Dr. Crandall, you have lost your mind. Shocked him with the paddle, And this is, of course, appropriate. I mean, he's a doctor. He should use medical means, whatever means are available. But he shocked him with a paddle one more time. Immediately, the heartbeat was normal. And the nurse began screaming, Dr. Crandall, what have you done? But in some of his extremities, it already turned black. I mean, he was not just dead, Dr. Crandall said, but very obviously dead. But he was raised, and Dr. Crandall went back into the hospital. This was a Saturday. He came back on Monday. He was talking to the guy. The guy didn't have brain damage. I'm going to skip this one for the sake of time. These are just some samples where we have some more medical documentation. This is not the real picture here, but I didn't have the real picture of her, so I used one from the internet. But anyway, Dr. Rex Gardner, in his book Healing Miracles, has a number of documented cases. One of them is of a 9-year-old girl who was deaf without her hearing aid. She had just been tested by the audiologist the day before. She was praying for her healing. She was instantly healed. The parents called the audiologist. He said, that is not possible. This is auditory nerve damage. This is not psychosomatic. This is not, an ear infection. This is auditory nerve damage. It doesn't just go away. He tested her. He said, I have no explanation for this, but she is completely healed. There are eyewitnesses, some of whom I know personally, who testified the healing of deaf Muslims in Jesus' name in Mozambique. This became such a big deal that there were certain areas that were on the government maps were considered Muslim areas that are now considered predominantly Christian areas, because they would pray, the people would be healed, they'd start a church the next day. And it led to massive church growth from the people who knew these people who were deaf and were no longer deaf. It's now been documented with some medical tests. It was documented in the Southern Medical Journal in September of 2010. As you can imagine, there was a big flurry on the internet, and there were people saying, the testing conditions weren't adequate. What could you do under those conditions in Mozambique? They did the best that they could, but Candy Gunther Brown, who was one of the authors of the study, answers the critics in her publication, Testing Prayer, published by Harvard University Press in 2012. And I've read it, I read the critiques. I think she has the much better argument. When you read what actually went on in these studies, she makes a very strong case. There are other academic works published by Oxford and so on, a book on medical miracles with Catholic medical miracles. There's been, of course, a lot of work done on Lourdes. This is the healing of a broken back from Dr. Nonyam Nombere. And there are a number of these, but I'm trying to focus preferably on the ones where I have pictures or something to show you. Carl Cockerell, he was on a vacation in Missouri. He was from Michigan, I believe, and he broke his ankle so badly that the doctor kept him overnight, put a cast on his ankle, kept him overnight. While he was in the hospital, he believed he had a vision of Jesus who told him he was healed. The next morning, the doctor discharged him, said, okay, you need to see your home doctor when you go back to Michigan. So his wife drove all the way back to Michigan. They got back, and his doctor there ordered another X-ray, another radiology report. And this is a week later. The new radiology report says, the doctor looked at it, he says, not only do you not have a broken ankle, you've never had a broken ankle. So he showed him the first report. The doctor said, now that's a broken ankle. Joy Wanifred, she had vertical heterophoria, and the condition was so classic that she was actually the one that at the time was used on the pamphlet to advertise the condition, vertical heterophoria. She had constant migraines because of this. She had to wear very thick glasses that would keep out the light and had a certain prescription for her glasses. She was a student at Taylor University when another student was praying for her and she was healed. And she'd had this condition for years. She went back to her doctor. who was a specialist in vertical heterophoria, her doctor said, well, this isn't a miracle, because her doctor didn't believe in miracles. But she had to give her the documentation that she was healed, because she needed it for a driver's license to show that she didn't have to wear glasses anymore. She now had 20/20 vision. I wish I had 20/20 vision. But we have the documentation. But by the way, I had to block out the reports I have the names of the doctors, but I blocked them out because it's not courteous and I don't know the HIPAA laws well enough to know if I would be in trouble, but it's at least not courteous to give all their names in public. But anyway, there was a medical trainee in North Wales, and this is also from Rex Gardner. She was dying in a hospital. She was healed completely after prayer. Even her eye scarring disappeared. It's all medically documented. There's no naturalistic medical explanation. In the med school, they still talk about this experience. Lisa Larios, she had bones that were deteriorating from bone cancer. She was healed instantly, and not only did the condition not go further, but her bones actually were healed. And again, that's not something that happens on its own. Now, sometimes people ask about, well, what about limbs growing back? I don't have very many, I found reports of that, but they were not accessible to me where I could go interview the people. So I haven't included those. They're mentioned in the book, but they're not mentioned in the section where I could document things in any way. I believe God can do that, but we don't see them in the Bible either, so we just don't have as many of those as far as I've seen. But we do have some things that might be considered analogous to that. In other words, visible miracles. And actually, there are some that I was persuaded of where there were large gash wounds that disappeared overnight. And there was one case of a withered leg that filled out over the course of like an hour or two. And there were some other things like that where I thought they were persuasive, but it wasn't like it was all cut off at the elbow and suddenly it grows out. I don't have anything like that. But Wansuk and Julie Ma. Wansuk is the director at the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. There was someone that they prayed for who had a large goiter, and the goiter instantly disappeared in their sight. And actually I have a number of reports of that. But one of Hume's issues was a witness that has a lot to lose. Their reputation is at stake. They have a lot to lose from making these claims. And when I wrote the book, I was figuring I have a lot to lose from making an argument that miracles happen, because I didn't think that was very welcome in the academy. But I've been surprised, and maybe what Gary was talking about the decline of the naturalistic worldview has been partly a reason for that. But anyway, they are credible witnesses. Someone else I know, he was a Moravian pastor, Douglas Norwood, and this happened in Suriname, where there was a skeptic who was challenging them at the church. He had an arm that had been paralyzed all his life, and he was shouting, "I defy this Christian God!" And suddenly his hand shot up in the air. He was like in his 60s or 70s. His hand shot up in the air that had been paralyzed all his life, and he looked at it. He was converted. The people around him were converted, and this was the beginning of a people movement among predominantly Hindu people in Nikari, Suriname. And there's documentation for the people movement. I'll give one more of these, and this was from Danny McCain. He's a friend of mine. He's spent about 30 years ministering in Nigeria. But with Danny, I figured he'd have some reports from Nigeria of miracles. He says, I can give you one from the U.S. When I was a boy, my family, we were praying for my little baby brother who had been scalded all over with hot water. And they sent him back from the hospital, but at the hospital they had to remove his clothes because his skin was tearing off when they were trying to take the clothes off. And he was just crying and crying. His skin was all red and burned all over. And he said, while we were all praying, I noticed that my baby brother had stopped crying. And I looked up, and he was crawling across the floor, and his skin was perfectly pink, new, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. And he was fine. There are just a few reports of nature miracles I want to give. Emmanuel Thompson from the Evangelical Church of West Africa. He has a lot of stories because his father was planting churches in northern Nigeria. He was my closest friend besides Jesus. He was my closest friend when he was in seminary, and he actually became my colleague teaching Hebrew Bible after he finished his PhD at Palmer Seminary when I was teaching there. But Emmanuel, when he was a boy, his father had just gone into a new village, and rainy season was about to start, and he didn't have the roof on his house yet. And so the neighbors were making fun of him. They were laughing at him. They were saying, look, everything you have is going to be drenched. It's going to be ruined because, look, obviously it's rainy season. Look, the rains are coming. They're on the horizon. Everything's going to be ruined. And his father got really mad, and he said, it's not going to rain one drop of rain on this village until I get the roof on my house. Well, that was going to take about 4 days. And they just laughed at him and left. He fell on his face before God and said, oh God, what have I done? Please, for the honor of your name. But for the next 4 days, it rained all around the village, but not a single drop of rain fell in that village. And those people who knew what rainy season was in their region, by the end of those 4 days, there was only one person in that village who had not become a Christian. Watchman Nee has a similar account of nature miracles. I'm going to skip the others and just say something that I've seen directly. But, of course, nature miracles are usually not dismissed as merely psychosomatic either. What I've seen directly, it's not as dramatic as some of those, but just to give an example of something that I have seen directly myself. It was around 1983. I was a fairly new Christian. I was in college. I was helping out at a nursing home Bible study when there was this woman named Barbara. Every week she was saying, I wish I could walk, I wish I could walk. And finally one day the leader of the Bible study walked over to her and he said, in the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk. And he lifted her by the hand and began walking around the room. Now, I stared horrified. She looked horrified. If faith is a bias, neither one of us can be accused of it. And I don't think it was psychosomatic for that reason, but he walked around the room, and she was still scared. But from then on, Barbara could walk. And, you can say it was psychosomatic, but how would he have known that? Back then, I wasn't planning to write a book on miracles, so I didn't think of getting any kind of medical documentation. But and there are other people who were there who saw it as well. But what struck me in particular, some of these things you could say, okay, maybe that's a coincidence, maybe that's a coincidence. Maybe this raising from the dead thing, well, every once in a while you think somebody's dead, and they're stiff, their eyes are rolled back in their head, they're cold, even though it's a tropical climate, they're cold. Maybe it's just a coincidence that you just thought they were dead and they started breathing, no breathing detected before, no heartbeat detected before, but suddenly they start breathing when you pray. So what would you give that? Would you give that 1 chance in 1,000? But when I started talking with people in my immediate circle, people I knew, there were about 10 of these in my immediate circle. So what is 1 in 1,000, 10 times over? I don't think the odds of this are very good for coincidence, that these all happened just when somebody prayed in the name of Jesus.